My name is Charles Epting, and you're listening to the Lost Labels podcast. I spoke to Henry Priestman of Yachts and Gabe Black of The Adverts about Stiff Records, and the gentleman I'm speaking to today tangentially played a big part in the early history of Stiff Records, but I don't want to put him in a box. I don't want to just label him as a Stiff Records guy because his career is so much more interesting and diverse than that. Today we're going to be speaking to Huw Gower, who first rose to prominence as a member of The Records, best known for their great hit Starry Eyes, which is one of my favorite songs ever recorded. And then he went on to have a great solo career, a very critically acclaimed EP in 1984. He played in David Johansen's band of the New York Dolls. He's had a fascinating career, but the reason I'm slotting his episode here amongst the other Stiff Records episodes is because in 1978, The Records served as Rachel Sweet's backing band on the Be Stiff tour. This was the second Stiff Records tour after the success of the 1977 tour with Elvis Costello, Nick Lowe, Ian Dury, Larry Wallace, and Wreckless Eric. They tried to recapture that magic with the Be Stiff tour in 1978. This time, you had Wreckless Eric again, as well as Jonah Louie, Mickey Jupp, Lene Lovich, and Rachel Sweet. Rachel Sweet needed a backing band, and Stiff Records got her The Records, which is something I'm really excited to talk to Huw about. So that's the connection to Stiff Records here, and I'm hopeful that Huw will have some interesting stories about that period of his career. But more than that, The Records released a great debut album on Virgin Records in 1979. It was just called The Records in the United States. In the UK, it was called Shades in Bed. A couple of great singles off that record, including Starry Eyes and Tina Rama. They also covered Rock and Roll Love Letter. They did a bonus 7-inch EP that came with that record of cover songs. And again, Huw Gower's career from there gets more interesting. And, he had his hand in a lot of fantastic projects. And I'm really excited to speak to him today. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Huw Gower to the Lost Labels podcast. Huw, first and foremost, can you take me back to the beginning, how you got your start in the music industry, what your early bands were like?
Well, okay, I'll just give you a little prehistory, if you will. I've been in bands, and the last count, I think I've been in 26 different bands, maybe more now. So I was in this band called Magic Muscle around 1971, 72, and then I was in a band called The Dragons, and that was like 76 to 78, and we were signed to a label called DJM we did one record with them. So I was still living in the city called Bristol at the time. So eventually it was several other musicians that I'd worked with in a band called The Fabulous Rat Bites from Hell had moved up to London and was starting to get some success. So one guy was still a friend of mine, John Perry, who joined a band called The Only Ones. You might have heard of them. So, kind of the writing was on the wall. Better move to London. Want to keep working as a musician. So I answered an ad in the Melody Maker for a guitar player, and it turned out to be them. The three of them had already got together, and they'd auditioned many guitar players, and they finally settled upon me. And that was February of 78, I believe. Yeah, February, yeah. And so it started for me there.
I spoke to Andy Murray, who was the press officer for Stiff Records, about what it was like to put together the Be Stiff 1978 tour. Can you talk a little bit about how The Records came to back Rachel Sweet on that tour?
Yeah, well, okay, so, I don't know how much he told you. I can just, maybe I'll just, fill in the same blanks, if you will. But the Coastal Flyers were managed by a guy called Paul Conroy. And at that point, Paul was working as the general manager for Stiff Records. And he and Will Birch had maintained, a good friendship. So Paul called Will up and said, how would it be for you guys if you come and be Rachel's backing band for this tour that they were putting together? And Will rather smartly said, only if we can play our own set as well. So Paul said, okay. I think he had to run it by Dave Robinson first. And so I think what like Will said, they really like the sound of Rachel Sweet and the records, So anyway, so that it came about. If you can find it, there's actually a BBC recording of Rachel Sweet and the records.
It's a great recording because it has Lene Lovich and Wreckless Eric sets as well from that era. And the recordings of you guys with Rachel Sweet are just fantastic.
I heard it a while ago, and I think we were a good band backing her up. Yeah, and the vocals were great, and we did a good job on that. So it was a good melding experience for us. So just prior to that, we had actually, that was September, late September. We'd actually recorded Starry Eyes in London on I can give you the date, September the 3rd, I believe it was, 1978. And the record was not released until after the tour was over. And Virgin Records was very interested in signing us. They wanted to put that out as like a test record, so it came out on a label in England called The Record Company, which is basically Virgin, but they were kind of hiding the fact that it was, I suppose, for reasons that totally escaped me. I have no idea why they wanted to do that. And it was met with deaf ears, essentially. So fortunately, to establish the longevity of that recording, we then were after the Stiff tour in Britain had finished, we came over to New York and did, it was 4 nights at the Bottom Line, 2 shows a night. Brought a box of 25 copies of this 45, and this is going back to the days when DJs could play the music that they liked, believe it or not. And these DJs from the local radio stations, New York stations, turned up to see the show, came into the tour bus that was parked outside the Bottom Line because there wasn't enough room to have all, because there was 5 bands playing on the night. And we're all given copies of this record. And lo and behold, the next day it started showing up on the radio. And it was this kind of bushfire, you might call it. I hate to use that expression right now, considering what's going on in California, but it slowly spread across the country, and to the point where, and this might be a hard thing to wrap your brain around, I'm giving you the history of it. At the time, AM radio had a policy that they could not play any records that hadn't been domestically released in the United States. Well, I know, it's kind of hard to believe. AM radio started playing Starry Eyes probably around April of 79. So it was a kind of a gradual hit. If it had all been planned and we'd come over and done the tour and all the rest of it at the same time, it might have been a much bigger charting record than it actually was. But it was actually on the radio for like 8-9 months. Well, certainly 4 or 5 before we actually even got here. And that's kind of the history of Starry Eyes, and it set the whole thing up. Virgin wanted an album, so we had to record. Well, we had to. I mean, it was a very enjoyable experience for the most part. So the idea was, they wanted to launch Virgin Records, or relaunch Virgin Records in the States, and they had done this deal with Atlantic to distribute the label, and we were the flagship band, and so that was great for a while. It all went really well until Led Zeppelin put out their next album. The Atlantic promotion that went like, all right, screw the records, we're going to promote Led Zeppelin from now on. Anyway. But that's how that went about. And then, we came back to England and nothing happened. We went on a brief tour with Robert Palmer, who had to cancel after 4 days because his wife had a premature birth. And I was out of the band just before Christmas of that year, actually 79. So my tenure in the band was less than 2 years, actually.
One particular gig I was reading about that I thought sounded interesting was when you guys opened for Rockpile at the Roundhouse. Do you remember that show at all?
Oh, yeah. I actually had a conversation with Dave Edmunds about the guitars we were both using. Yeah, I do remember that.
It seems to me, as an outsider at least, that scene in London, everyone was going to see each other's gigs, everyone was playing in each other's bands. It seems like it was very communal, even sort of incestuous to a point. Is that what it was like? What did it feel like to be in the midst of that, sort of coming out of pub rock, entering punk and new wave in the late 70s in London?
Yeah, it's a fair assessment of it. I mean, London seems like it's a huge rock and roll city, but actually, at the time there was, I don't know, probably 400 musicians total in the sense, and so bands got shuffled around, and effectively subtract the Clash and the Sex Pistols and that side of punk, if you will. The rest of us we'd all been playing for quite a while, so we weren't really about to. We had to sort of dumb it down a little bit, in a sense. I mean, I started playing guitar when I was 12 years old. I'm the same age as the guys in the Pistols, maybe a bit older than some of them. But I didn't pick up a guitar in 1976 and then learn 5 chords. I picked up the guitar in 1964, actually. So, the whole idea for me was to try and learn how to play well. And I think, a lot of what turned into Stiff was really, a continuation of pub rock, as it was called back then. Nick Lowe, Brinsley Schwartz, those guys, still trying to make a living, essentially, and obviously in certain cases, quite successfully, as it turns out, of some sort, anyway. But I suppose it was kind of incestuous. I mean, but yeah, it was cases like, that guy's good. Let's see if he wants to be in our band. I mean, Will Birch and Phil Brown saw me playing at this is what Phil told me afterwards, before I joined the band. There was a gig on in Kensington called the Greyhound, which was a place where everybody played, from Elvis Costello and all those guys. So this was a gig thrown together by, of all people, Peter Perrett from The Only Ones and Johnny Thunders. So John Perry says, let's put the Rat Bites together and we'll do a 3-song set. And we did, and it went over really well. We actually played the Everly Brothers song "Price of Love," which I still like. It's a great, rock band song. And Will and Phil were at that gig. So Phil, actually, I remember Phil coming up to me afterwards and saying, as you might say in London, "Nice one, mate." And 2 weeks later, I answered this ad in the Melody Maker, and it turns out to be them. I don't remember it at the time, but Phil reminded me that they had seen us there, and I think it was like they kind of, to use a London expression, they clocked me. That guy was for us, and it turns out that they took me on. But what they didn't, I think, really appreciate was the fact that I was a songwriter. They didn't really want a songwriter; they wanted a lead guitarist, and I could do both, So that ultimately led to tensions because, a couple of songs that I wrote, one ended up on the album, and the singer of the band was a little bit protective, shall we say, of that aspect of it. Whereas other bands would be like, "Oh yeah, bring them on, let's hear them," and that was just to put sort of patina to the my exit from the band was like that wasn't really being welcomed anymore. But I couldn't really contribute more than I was already doing. And as you might, I actually did write the guitar part on Stereos, which I never got label credit for. But fortunately, as the years have gone by, at least other guitar players know that I did that, because you don't write a part like that unless you're a guitar player. You don't sit down, especially the way that pop musicians don't write so much as literally write it on the paper. They just say it goes like this, So can you say? I remember them saying to me, "Can you make it sound like the Byrds?" Well, I said, "I don't have a 12-string guitar. I'm left-handed. There aren't too many of those in London in 1978, So I'm playing octaves on the guitar, which meant that I was a cut above, I don't know, the guys who were playing punk, can't do that. I mean, well, I don't want to self-aggrandize too much, but I was a pretty decent guitar player back then, and I could do that. And so I made it sound like it was a 12-string, but it wasn't, you know.
Well, I have to admit, my favorite song changes on nearly a daily basis, but more often than not, I think I would point to Starry Eyes as just the most perfect, beautiful, catchy pop rock song ever constructed. I am just obsessed with that song.
Well, thank you. I mean, you know, I still play it occasionally. I think it holds up really well after 42 years at this point.
In addition to your writing contributions to the band, I noticed that you also have a production credit on the album, in addition to the bonus 7-inch of covers that was included with the LP. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. We would. The bonus was, again, it was Will Butcher's. He hung out with publicists a lot. Let's do something unique to promote the album. Other bands, Flaming Groovies come to mind. For example, they put a lot of covers on their albums. I said, well, we don't need to do that, but how about we do an EP, as they were called back then, of covers, and just include it as a giveaway with the album. So we had a weekend to record it in, and we also needed a B-side for what was going to be. It was supposed to be the B-side of Teen-A-Rama, actually, which they were all convinced was going to be a huge hit. Personally, I think that's the worst song the records ever did, because the lyrics are so creepy, especially in retrospective. You know, as a dad, you know, a father of a mature daughter, and that was like, really, you know, Teen-A-Rama. Sorry. Anyway, moving on from that, we had 2 days to record these 4 songs and this B-side, which turned out to be The Phone. Well, originally, and I'm giving you a real backstory here, the song that we recorded, Rock and Roll Love Letter, was supposed to have been on the album, side 2, track 4. And when Virgin heard the rough mix of The Phone, they said, well, that's better. Let's put that on the album too. So Tim Freeze-Green, who was finishing off the production of the record, mixed it, and that's how it got on the album. So I got a production credit for that. And essentially what happened was we went in on the Saturday, recorded the basic tracks, and then on the Sunday, myself and Phil Brown were the only 2 members of the band that basically showed up. So we kind of finished it off, and I was just coming up with all these ideas. And I mean, it was like, it's like a kid with, you know, in a candy store or in a toy store, actually, really. Like, oh, well, we did 1984. So, well, that has a Hammond organ on it. Okay, pick up the phone, call and say, rent us a Hammond organ, you know, and of course it just shows up about an hour later. That was the great thing about having that kind of, you know, money behind you. Of course, it all ended up on the royalty statement sheet, but you know, I mean, I'm a fairly quick study when it came to recording, and when I was in the band The Dragons, although it never came out, we recorded basically an album's worth of music at DJM, and I kind of learned the process of 24-track recording, what you can do, you know, and so I kind of started applying that to that experience, and but I think it turned out pretty good, actually. I think 1984 is actually the best one, and we all picked one, but I picked that one, so maybe that's why I'm biased.
The inclusion of that 7-inch was a real nice little treat. I had a copy of the record without the 7-inch, and when I came across another copy at a store recently that still had the EP tucked inside, I had to buy that one. As a completist.
Yeah. In England, it was actually a 12-inch EP. You know, I don't know whether you saw the English version of it, but anyway.
I've seen it online, but I still have to track that one down.
Yeah. It was almost like a double album, really, because it was 2 12-inch records. But of course, it was only 4 tracks. But yeah, so that's how I inadvertently became one of the producers on that record. So, it's got me a few gigs later on from bands who had heard that, I'd worked with subsequently in this country.
Now, Starry Eyes was re-recorded for the UK version of the album. What went into that decision? What made you guys get back in the studio and recut a version of the single?
thought that was a mistake myself too. Okay, so they're looking around for producers. Producers was like, finding the right producer and the record will be a smash and all that kind of, record company logic. So they eventually settled on this guy called Mutt Lange, the guy that ruined country music through Shania Twain.
I also know him as the guy who did Boomtown Rats and Deaf School and Def Leppard and Graham Parker and the Motors.
Yeah, all crappy records too, if I may say so, personally.
This must have been around the time he did Back in Black as well.
Right, that was the record he did after us. So we'll have to give him a carte blanche for that one because that's, at least got two great songs on it. And I think he actually sort of probably stepped back and said, "These guys know what they're doing. I'll just press the record button or whatever." But anyway, so he agreed that he would do only 4 tracks. Rock and Roll Love Letter. He wanted to recut Starry Eyes, Teen-A-Rama, and Girls That Don't Exist. I think that was the 4. His heart wasn't in the project, to be honest with you. I mean, a friend of mine came over to the sessions one day, and I'm out in the studio putting on my guitar solo for Teen-A-Rama, which was an overdub with a harmony part. And while I'm doing it, my friend's sitting in the control booth, and Mutt's on the phone with his wife/girlfriend, choosing wallpaper for their new house. So, I mean, if that encapsulates a certain, I mean, it was going to be 5. He wanted Affection Rejected was the one he wanted to do, but he wanted to change the lyric because he didn't think it was a positive lyric. And then then he came in one day singing "Running on Empty," that Jackson Browne song. So at that point, all right, forget that. We're not doing that. And in the end, Rock and Roll Love Letter was dropped off the album, so we ended up having 3 tracks, and one of them was the remake of Starry Eyes. Well, the American label had the smart to say, well, this is already on the radio in its original form. It sounds much better. The other version is slower, it's slicker, and I had to fight to get my vocal part on that track because I think he'd done the harmony. He fucked up Girls That Don't Exist. Like, his voice is that harmony voice in there, and it's like louder than the lead vocal. So I think it was just like an ego trip for him. So, I've had people say, like, it must have been a real honor to work with Mutt Lange. I say, no, actually, it was kind of a drag because his heart wasn't in the project. Enter Tim Freeze-Green. Tim was great. Tim was a really talented piano player, actually, although he didn't play on the recording. But he just had more. He had kind of a more. I think he did Talk after us. He just had soul, He was a really nice guy. But yeah, Mutt could only do 4 tracks because he was already booked to do what became Back in Black. So give him credit for that. And mine was probably on different things. So there you go. So that's my story of Mutt Lange. I mean, I've heard people say different things about that, and that's just my personal experience. I don't think it was. I think he was just trying to superimpose himself on the project without really. He sang on Rock and Roll Love Letter too. He ruined that. I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's not my favorite song either. But I didn't really have much of a say in the choice of material. I just had to play it. But I did rearrange Insomnia. Insomnia was originally a punk rock track. I said, well, let's play it like maybe the Police would do it. And that's how it ended up on the record. Some of it did.
One last question about your time in the UK, and then we'll shift to your career after you moved to New York. But I'm curious about what it was like to play backing Rachel Sweet. Was it respectable to play for her? Did people take her seriously as a singer, or was it more of a novelty to see this 16, 17-year-old girl from Ohio, who's sort of like a fish out of water amongst all these punk and pub rock bands? What was that like for you as a musician having to back someone like that?
So it's probably a bit of all of the above, really. She was, I think she was probably only 15 when she recorded the thing. Liam Sternberg produced it and wrote the songs mostly, although they dropped some covers in after they got the tapes. Liam eventually wrote "Walk Like an Egyptian" for the Bangles. Is it the Bangles that did that? Yeah. So he probably retired on the strength of that one. it was tricky actually because I mean she was as any trained singer would tell you, her singing on that recording is pretty amateurish on a certain level, but she has a certain pluck to her that is, I think, I haven't listened to it in ages, but I think she was. I think ultimately, as we went along, doing the live gigs, she settled in. But she's a kid, 16. She was on the road with her sister, and they had a tutor, because that was the law then. You had to have a tutor, and I think the tutor eventually went mad and ran away. Can't say I blame her in some respects, but it was. I've said it in a song actually. If you've heard, the song "Circuses in Town," that's basically about that experience, and it was a fabulous tour actually. But anyway, try and answer your question about Rachel. I don't think she was the most accomplished singer, but she had a lot of pluck. Let's put it like that. And I mean, in the end, I don't want to judge her too harshly, because I think that, from what I understand, that she doesn't really have. I haven't spoken with her in years. She went on to become a founding director of Comedy Central.
From what I've read, it sounds like she's had quite an illustrious career post-music.
Yeah, so she became a businesswoman. Let's put it like this. She sold her Bel Air house to Madonna some years ago for $8 million, so she must be doing something well, right?
So after your departure from the records, what was your next move? I know you played with Carlene Carter.
Oh, that was just a session, actually. I never played. I mean, I did. I think I played guitar on one track and sang back up on a couple of things. I was working with a guy that was signed to Chrysalis Records, and we happened to be in the same studio. We were doing the afternoon session, and then Carlene and Nick were in for the evening, and Billy Bremner was supposed to be the guitar player, and I think they'd had something of a tiff, and Billy didn't show up, and they just heard what I was doing. They said, "Well, you want to stick around?" And I said, "Okay." So, why not? And so that's how that came about. But no, basically, I did a bunch of different things between that and then coming to the States. Little projects here and there that I had a band that didn't really get off the ground, and I actually briefly joined Holly and the Italians. I was approached to be rhythm guitarist in Dire Straits after Mark Knopfler's brother left, obviously they had a brotherly falling out. That didn't pan out either. I auditioned for Peter Gabriel, but it turned out that he was going to be promoting his third album with the one that has Biko and Games Without Frontiers on it. Turned out that Robert Fripp was actually going to be playing the guitar, and I just wanted somebody to stand on the stage and look like they were playing the guitar while Fripp played behind a curtain. So in a way, I'm glad I didn't get that gig. So anyway, in the end, I ended up in New York, and then things got a bit more consistent for a while, you might say.
Was there any session work that you found particularly interesting to be a part of?
I did do a session for Rachel's second album. I played on a song called "Take Good Care of Me," but they didn't credit any of the musicians on that record. But that's my guitar solo on that track. I also co-wrote her version of "Be Stiff." She and I did that in a hotel room in Londonderry on the middle of the Stiff tour. But the songwriting credit went to the guy in Devo because it was his title. But Rachel and I wrote that together.
Really? Because that was an interesting idea, that Be Stiff tour sampler that had each artist's interpretation of the Devo song that became a de facto anthem for the label.
Well, that was the genius of Dave Robinson at the time, if you might say. It was with Stiff Records.
I've heard a lot of stories about both Dave Robinson and Jake Riviera at Stiff. What do you remember from working with Dave?
Yeah, well, I wasn't around for Jake. That was, I mean, they had the big part in the ways, I guess, before I was anything to do with Stiff. But he was a good cheerleader for a while. You might have heard this from other people, but especially Andy Murray would know more about Dave Robinson than I could ever know. But he would say, in his Northern Irish accent, musicians, they're like pebbles on the beach. I can pick them up whenever I want, So he kind of made you laugh in some respects. But he liked me. Oh, he did put me in the studio with Henry McCulloch, who had been in Wings and Joe Cocker's band. And eventually some of those tracks came out on a German label called Line some years later. That was interesting because Paul Carrick, was on keyboards, and of all people, Barry Wom, aka John Halsey, was the drummer. From Barry Wom from
the Ruddles.
Yeah. Chrissy Stewart played bass. Chrissy Stewart ended up being Frankie Miller's right-hand guy until Frankie basically almost killed himself with alcohol, I guess. So that was I felt quite flattered to be, because to me these were older guys, and they were, Henry was at Woodstock with Joe, seasoned players, shall we say. So that was nice. And Dave Robinson had been actually the road manager for a band that Henry was in, back in the Irish days, and that's how they kept a relationship. And Henry and I stayed in touch a little bit. I actually have a letter that he wrote me some time ago before he died. So yeah, that was nice. That was actually before. Where was that? That would have been early 1979, I guess.
Once you were in New York, how did you get linked up with David Johansen? How did you come to be in his band?
Same way as I got the gig in the records. I answered an ad in the Village Voice, which at the time was like, in Britain in the 70s, the Melody Maker was where you went if you were looking for a journeyman type gig, if you will. And back in like 81 when I came here, that's what the Village Voice was. You had to buy it those days. It cost $1, I think. And there was this, you kind of went by the size of the ad. If it was like a kind of little block of about, 3 by 1 or 2 by 1, it was like, okay, these people might have they might have some money to back up this request for a guitar player. So I answered that, and by that point, I suppose because of Starry Eyes, luckily, I suppose my reputation preceded me at some point. So I got an immediate call back and ended up getting the gig.
And you're on the Live It Up live album, right?
Yes. Yeah. That's the whole point of putting that down. They had fired the other two. No, Blondie Chaplin I replaced Blondie Chaplin. That's a nice big feeling to have. I met Blondie, actually. He was a very nice guy. But and they fired the other guitar player, and they took on 2 players at the time, myself and this other guy called David Nelson. And with I think the thinking behind it was that they'd seen people like Peter Frampton have this massive success with a live album after not having much success with studio records. So they thought they could do the same thing with David, but didn't quite. Well, the Animals medley was definitely very popular. It was the most popular video on MTV in like 1983, I suppose, whenever MTV first started, right? Before MTV completely ruined the music business, as far as I'm concerned. The premise was that they wanted to put a good, crack live band together to record a live album, which is what happened, which is great, right? Because we worked a lot. The band got really tight very fast. And the keyboard player, Charlie Giordano, is with Springsteen now, as a matter of fact.
In 1984, you released your debut solo EP. What was that like for you, transitioning from being a member of these bands to all of a sudden being the center of attention and having your own name on something?
Well, of course, it's a great stroke. It's good for your ego, but like, I get to have my picture on the front of the cover all by myself and the rest of it. Yeah. But it was a joy to make that record. And I was still in Johansen's band while we were doing that. But I got to call the shots, as it were, and the songs were, well, there was 3 of them were essentially mine. And yeah, I just thought, well, it's nice to make your own record. I didn't really think anything else of it, but then when the reviews started coming out, I realized, wow, people seem to really like this. It was a bit of a surprise, to be honest with you. Did you find this? I put together a CD version of that relatively recently, and added some tracks from that time frame to round it out.
I have heard the CD, and I think that French Girls is just one of the catchiest songs.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm really proud of that one, actually.
It reminds me of, I guess it's called college rock, but that 80s scene when you had Tommy Keene and the Replacements and these big jangly guitars with very catchy pop hooks. That's what that EP and subsequent CD remind me of.
Yeah, I guess I can write in that style. I can write in other styles too, but that's why I compiled that collection of tracks, because I felt for the most part that's where they all kind of fit together. But yeah, so for the first time in my life, I actually had calls from record companies, bigger ones, going, they wanted to talk to me and so forth. But I did have a guy from a label say to me after he listened to it, so like, well, it's good, but no one knows what a heretic is. You can't put that out on an album, calling out the heretics being in the song. Like, well, I beg to differ a little bit, but maybe I'm better educated than you are. I don't know, but I think most people know what a heretic is. That's just an aside to that as we're talking about it. But She's Still a Mystery turned out pretty good too. And yeah, I mean, I was mining a theme there that I knew kind of was something that I done a bit of with the records. That was just something I knew I could do, so I did it some more. But as the years went on, subsequently to that, I just found myself, well, the music business really changed after MTV, and I found myself thinking, well, I'm Charles, at that point, I'm 30, and which is considered, about that time was considered old, 2 years later, I become a dad, and and at that point, it's like all these hair bands and spandex bands and all this stuff from Duran Duran and all this crap coming out of England. The stuff that I'd actually left the country in a way to get away from. The synthesizers swam across the Atlantic and surrounded me. That I didn't find a way to fit in particularly anymore, or feel that it was really, it's just not easy to grow old in the music business if you want to keep changing as a musician. If you want to keep, or at least, should we say, keep growing as a musician? It might be a better way of putting it. But apart from the Rolling Stones, how many bands have lasted that long? It's like usually after a while, they just start repeating themselves, and the records that they make, or the recordings, just become what the record company wants them to do and not what they want to do themselves. So at some point, I just started, screw this, I'm just going to write what I feel like. And that's where the Ile-de-France album started, took its genesis.
And since then, you've got 2 CDs out with Icecream Skyscraper. It really seems like you're making the kind of music that you want to. It really seems like you're, taking all of your influences and blending them all together to create something really special. I've been listening to those 2, and I enjoy them very much.
Oh, thank you. I'm so pleased that you did. Yeah. I mean, it's like, this may sound a bit conceited, but one likes to try and make recordings that you want to actually listen to yourself after you've done them. Maybe not right away afterwards, but put them on a couple of years later and go like, oh yeah, that turned out pretty good. That was kind of what I was going for. So yeah, and again, somebody said to me about the first Icecream Skyscraper thing. He said, you're all over the place. You're doing this, you're doing that, you're doing that. And I said, yeah, that's because that's my musical taste. I don't just listen to, people say, who's your favorite guitarist? I said, well, how long have you got? Because I could name 100 guitar players that I like and still not have, I'll be going back going, well, wait, I forgot so and so, whatever, or who's your favorite musician? Well, there isn't such a, that's an easy question to ask somebody who doesn't really listen to music very much. But for somebody like me who's been listening to it since I was like 5 or even before that, I've heard quite a lot of great records over the years. My wife loves it. We have Alexa, and occasionally we just lie in bed, and I'm just thinking of songs that I haven't heard since like 1962 or something. We're like, I know, and sometimes you could have gone like, oh, well, that was a terrible idea. And other times you go like, wow, that is still a really good recording. So, my taste, shall we say, is Catholic, is that right?
Yeah.
Quite wide. And so, again, when I did that was, it's like musical therapy. It was like, well, I'm not trying to chase a market anymore because I can't, it's pointless, really. And nobody buys CDs anyway anymore. So even though I manufactured several hundred copies of both of them, easily available on CD Baby, folks.
I think it's great that you manufactured physical CDs, and I'm going to have to pick those up because right now I'm just streaming it on Apple Music, but I'd love to add those to my collection.
But I mean, to be fair, this is the problem with streaming music. It's like it's all MP3s, and compared to Wave 4 format, which is the way that the CDs are actually manufactured in, it's night and day because the sound is squeezed. When you put on the CD, you hear what the musicians or the producer or whatever you want to call it intended it to sound like. Whereas, it's rather like somebody said about making videos. You make this fantastic, fabulous cineramic thing, and then people are watching it on a phone. So I mean, they're now making videos like that. You're like, so that everything has to be centered into the middle. Obviously, that's the center, of course it is. There's no sense of like, well, what's going on in the background there? Well, it's like because nobody's looking at that. Now, my daughter's a musicologist. She's Dr. Huw Gower, actually. But she was teaching a class when she was at UCLA some years ago. And they were doing a unit on the Beatles, and she set her 17-year-olds the task of listening to Rubber Soul and then commenting on it for a paper, And she said, not the American version, the British version, because there's 3 extra tracks on that one. And the comments were like, I never listened to a whole record of one artist before. It's pretty good, I mean, that's where we're at in that respect. So, I mean, there's a bit, but you listen to a Beatles album, it's kind of like somebody said once, if the Beatles put out Sgt. Pepper like a few years ago, the label would have said, nah, it's too varied, man. You've got too many different styles on that record. It's never going to catch on. Again, for example, but so that's kind of the thing behind Icecream Skyscraper is like, just making music because you want to make it rather than for any particular reason. And I think that was the problem with as the industry grew. And, somebody said once the businessman saw Woodstock and said, if we can put a fence around that they won't break down, we can make a shitload of money. And of course they did. And that's what happened to the, you sign a band, it's like, okay, we need an album from you by, whenever, because we have to put it out for Christmas. Well, we only have 4 songs. That's all right. Put 1 on side 1, track 1, side 1, track 5, side 2, track 1, and side 2, track 5. In the middle, you put whatever you want. Doesn't matter because all we need is 4 tracks, And so people started writing, just what they call filler. And to me, filler is just like, well, that's what it is. It's like, filler is what you use to put in cracks in your wall. If you know what I mean, it doesn't belong anywhere. It belongs on the cutting room floor, you might say. I mean, occasionally something goes astray that you think, well, that should have gone out. But there's a lot of crap music out there, and as was it Duke Ellington said that, he said there's only two kinds of music, good and bad. I make good music, and he's right, so and I think the same thing about anything else, I mean, what is good music? It's whatever you like, really, ultimately, isn't it? So I mean, there's no what's good, what's bad, and so forth, but try to make something that you hope that everybody would like. And if you've got songs that are, if I'll do an Eric Satie arrangement next to, some kind of like sort of mock heavy metal track, whatever. It's like, it's just the way it came out of my head, folks.
Huw, I really appreciate you taking the time to speak. This has been an absolute pleasure and really enjoyable to hear your stories.
Oh, Charles, thank you so much for taking the time to listen to the music. And it's a real pleasure that you've done that. I really appreciate it.
I'll say it again. I think that Starry Eyes is the absolute perfect pop rock song. I don't think it gets any better than that. But you keep working your way through Huw's career, whether it's the Guitarophilia EP from 1984, whether it's his work with David Johansen, whether it's his recent work with Icecream Skyscraper. There's a sound and a commonality to all of these projects that ties them together, which is not to say that they sound alike. Huw has you can tell continuously pushed his career into new directions and pushed his playing into new directions. But what I love is that you can always tell it's a Huw Gower song. You can always tell it's his guitar playing. So this has been fascinating to hear about that 1978 Be Stiff tour and to hear about what it was like to play with Rachel Sweet. I'm also going to be speaking to, as I mentioned earlier, Andy Murray, who was the press officer who really put that tour together. So I think this will be a nice segue into that conversation with Andy to learn more about that tour, because so much attention is focused on that first Stiff tour, the 1977. It's what the documentary was made for. It's what the live album was released for. That I think it's interesting to and important to focus on this lesser-known 1978 tour, and even there was one the Son of Stiff tour a couple of years after that. I think these lesser-known tours are particularly important to highlight and to remember. So with that, I'm Charles Epting. This is the Lost Labels podcast. As always, thank you so much for listening. Until next time.